This conference will now be recorded.
Falling off for almost 3 years. You ought to have a truck for years.
You're ready to fall?
Huh?
I think you're ready to fall.
Oh, yeah.
We need to slide down.
No, just catch me if I fall.
Okay.
We'll call this work session of the Sedalia City Council to order. Roll call, please.
Robinson? Yes. Oldham? Here. Marshall? Here. Bogus?
Here.
Hiller is absent. Cross? Here. Foster?
Here.
Bliss? Here.
Councilor Lauber, you have the floor to begin our discussion.
Did I get a promotion? Nice. Or did you say counselor?
Council, yes.
Oh, sorry. Thank you, Mayor, members of the council. Good to see you this evening. Obviously, this has been a long path that the city has been working to get to this point to consider a transitional services ordinance. We've seen numerous public hearings, both in front of this council, the Transitional Services Committee, and the Planning and Zoning Commission, but this is the home stretch for this ordinance. At each transition stage, I have tried to preserve the ordinance in the manner it was approved. So when it was passed over from the Transitional Services Committee, tried to maintain that as it went to P&Z, so that you could see what the final work was done there. And same as this ordinance has passed from the Planning Commission over to the City Council. So as you review it, you may see that there are things like initial caps or punctuation or order of definitions. These are all things that at this point we have not gone through to do the final cleaning of this ordinance, but rather we've been focused on the conceptual piece of making sure that the items fit together. As you'll recall from our council training last year, that the council's role is to work on the big picture, the conceptual issues. Staff will address these non-substantive details when this ordinance comes before you for final consideration and approval. For tonight's meeting, you all received a large amount of materials to help you as you consider this ordinance. Much of what you received was also considered at the Transitional Services Committee and at the Planning Commission level, but some of it is new. That information is designed to help you as you make your decisions about this ordinance and to guide what you may feel is needed or important as you consider that. To help you conceptualize how the ordinance works, city staff developed a practical application framework, and we will use that framework as a guide for tonight's discussion. Starting as a very threshold question for the council is whether the city should allow transitional services to be provided in the city. Currently, our zoning codes are nearly silent as to transitional services, but as we've learned as we've gone through this process, the city has what's called permissive zoning. And by that, it means your zoning code lists out all of the uses that are permitted and in which districts they're permitted and under what circumstances they're permitted. And when it's not listed, then that is considered prohibited. The idea behind this particular ordinance would be to create uses for transitional services that could be utilized in the community. And so, again, that threshold question is do you want to provide those services? If you do, then some form of this ordinance is necessary. From there, then, it is your ordinance to amend and direct staff how you would like to see it change from that standpoint. So, diving into the practical application framework you see on your screens, initially, this is designed to help conceptualize exactly how and where the transitional services that are listed in the ordinance could be applied. So you see in the first series of boxes there, the question above it is, where would the transitional services be allowed to be used as of right? And when I say as of right, that means that in that district, you would not require a special use permit. You could just provide the services that are listed. So in order to make it so that we didn't have to break out every single zoning use along the left-hand margin, we just simply divided by residential, commercial, and industrial type uses. So you see that as kind of your lines that run right to left. Each of the columns then identifies a basic type of transitional services that are covered by the draft ordinances. So the columns would be shelters, which includes emergency shelters, temporary cooling shelters, warming shelters, all of the shelters in the first column, emergency housing, transitional housing, permanent supportive housing, and then support services. So again, focusing your attention on the very first set of boxes, this shows where in the city transitional services would be allowed with no special use required at all. So shelters are not allowed anywhere in the city without they're not allowed anywhere with as of right. But emergency housing is permitted without requirement of any sort of special use permit in the R1, R2, and R3 districts, and also in the CO, C1, and C3 districts. You see then transitional housing would be permitted in R1, 2, and 3, C3, and M1. Again, all without a special use permit. Permanent supportive housing then follows R1, R2, R3, C3, M1. And then finally, support services would be permitted under this particular ordinance in CO, C1, and C3 without a special use permit. Moving then to the second box, this would identify the areas of the city where transitionals would be allowed to be used, but they would be subject to special use permit requirements. And so before I dive into that one, maybe it's worth visiting for just a second. What does that really mean? So we talked about before, as of right. So as of right, just giving an example of housing. If you wanted to build a single family residential house in an R1 district, you can do that. But there are other circumstances in an R1 district where you might be required to get a special use permit to make another use of that property in addition to your R1, your single family residential house. What a special use permit does is, again, what it takes it creates additional requirements for an allowed use. Okay, so it does allow the use to go forward, but subject to special requirements, and that's essentially why we call it a special use permit. Again, where transitional services, where will transitional services be allowed but subject to a special use permit? For shelters, they will not be allowed in residential districts, but they would be allowed in CO, C1, C3, M1, and M2. Emergency housing would be required to use a special use permit in M1 and M2. But again, keep in mind that when we talk about the various zoning districts, there are 9 total, and you can count in each of these columns, you will always be able to count all 9 uses in one way or another. So for example, shelters are not permitted as of right anywhere. They are permitted with a special use permit in CO, C1, C3, M1, M2, which means they are prohibited then in R1, R2, R3, and C2. So you see how this works with the framework? So it makes it easier kind of at a glance. If you said, I'm curious, would emergency housing be allowed in a commercial district without a special use permit? Yes, in the CO, C1, and C3 districts, that would be permitted. Okay, so again, back to the special use permit requirements. Emergency housing would be permitted in an M1 and an M2 if a special use permit is obtained. Transitional housing would be permitted if a special use permit is obtained in CO, C1, C2, permanent supportive housing in the same areas, and then support services would be permitted in the city in any R3, M1, or M2 district subject to a special use permit. So that leaves us then with where would transitional services be prohibited, which is your last set of boxes here. So shelters, as we mentioned, they are prohibited in R1, R2, R3, C2. Emergency housing prohibited in C2. Transitional housing would be prohibited in M2. Permanent supportive housing in M2. And then support services would be prohibited in R1, R2, and C2. Are there any questions about that? Okay, hearing none. We did try to go through and also identify some kind of logical questions that may spring then from this framework. So the first question that we posed and attempted to answer for you is, what is a shelter? A shelter is a temporary or a permanent space made available to provide protection from the elements to those in need. What we suggest is the intent, and again, you get to determine what the intent is here. But what we're suggesting for you is the intent would be that these would be uses that provide very short-term services to get persons out of the element for individual periods of less than 24 hours. The intent is to regulate the provision of shelter services at the same locations on a frequent basis. This would include a typical homeless shelter. Shelter facilities provided as an ancillary purpose to the location's primary purpose are allowed to continue this use. An example is when a church opens as a warming shelter, that is an ancillary use to the primary purpose of a church, which is typically to provide a place for religious services, perhaps religious education, and other similar services. Shelters fall into 4 categories under the proposed ordinance. They would include day shelters, which would be utilized between 6 a.m. and 9 p.m., but those are not intended for overnight stays. Temporary cooling shelters are shelters that are, and again, these are paraphrasings of the actual language in the ordinance. So if you have questions about these, we can dive into the ordinance for additional detail. But again, this is designed to be kind of an overview to make sure you're able to conceptualize what the ordinance is attempting to do. Temporary cooling shelters are shelters operating between 7 a.m. and 9 p.m. when the outside temperature is predicted to be 95 degrees or above. So again, temporary cooling shelters not intended for an overnight stay. Temporary warming shelters are shelters that operate between 7 p.m. and 7 a.m. when the outside temperature is predicted to be 33 degrees or below. These are intended for overnight stays. And then finally, emergency shelters, a facility, the primary purpose of which is to provide an overnight shelter for homeless populations and is intended to include the allowance for overnight stays. Any questions about shelters? So the next question that we posed and attempted to answer for you is, what then is emergency housing? And if you'll notice, as we go down through this list, we're essentially going through the columns that are listed up above at the beginning of the framework. So what is emergency housing? Paraphrasing again the definitions, these are temporary indoor accommodations for individuals or families who are homeless or at risk of becoming homeless, and may be intended to address the basic health, food, clothing, personal hygiene needs of individuals or families, which may or may not require occupants to enter into a lease or occupancy agreement. So here, the suggested intent would be that the ordinance would be providing some sort of use that allows short-term overnight housing and hygiene facilities to persons who are temporarily without housing. For example, this might be if someone's house catches fire and they need a place to stay temporarily, or or perhaps a natural disaster like a tornado or a flood or something might occur. That this would be emergency housing would be a resource for them to keep them from being homeless while that temporary condition exists. Questions on that? So the next question that we posed is then, what is transitional housing? Transitional housing is residential facilities designed to assist individuals and families experiencing homelessness to transition them to a permanent residence within 24 months. The suggested intent here would be to provide mid-range provision of transitional housing services. These services are longer term than emergency housing, but shorter term than permanent supportive housing. This permits an organization or a facility to provide these services to those in need, with the understanding that if the individuals needing these services were in a position to do it on their own, they wouldn't fit the definition of homeless.
Joe, can you compare and contrast, just going back to emergency shelters and emergency housing?
So emergency shelters, again, would be more of a temporary situation, typically to get someone out of the elements. So an emergency shelter might be a situation where, maybe there is, it could be, it would be essentially, the situation where if a church needed to open up to provide overnight stays for individuals because it's so cold out. It would be really individuals who, again, because of elements, whether it be with the emergency, it would be, if they had a fire, if they had something where it was, again, it would be a much shorter term, where the transitional housing is designed to be something where it might be up to 2 years, because we had 24 months. So emergency is for a shorter period of time. Transitional housing is designed to be a longer period of time. And then the next one that we will cover is permanent supportive housing, which is an even longer period of time. So they're designed to approach the needs of individuals that would differ, because maybe the condition that they find themselves in is either more temporary or more permanent in nature, but not so permanent that they would actually no longer be homeless, if that makes sense. Okay, so we covered transitional housing. So then permanent supportive housing is that longest period of time that we would be looking to allow someone to provide services. So these would be subsidized residential facilities that prioritizes people who need comprehensive support services to retain residency. These facilities would pair people with on or off-site voluntary services designed to support a person who has a complex and disabling behavioral health or physical health condition, who was experiencing homelessness or was at imminent risk of homelessness prior to moving into the facility. So again, here, the suggested intent for this one is to provide the longest term, therefore greater than 24 months, which was covered by the transitional housing, yet still temporary provision of transitional housing to individuals with complex needs. So these folks would typically have some sort of a liaison with a local provider that maybe would be helping them through a condition that most likely would have created maybe the reason that they found themselves in a homelessness situation to begin with.
So if they've never been in a homeless situation, if they've been placed in permanent supportive housing by family, do they fall into this?
I think I would have to have an excellent.
So we have a group here in Sedalia that takes care of people that are disabled, and in my mind, we've always had permanent supportive housing of some sort for homes for people that are behaviorally and physically, I don't know if handicap's the right word anymore, but I'm following this until it says at an imminent risk of homelessness prior to moving into a facility. So you've got to be homeless before you can be in permanent supportive housing.
Right. I think maybe I can help by drawing a correlation, we have elderly persons in our community that, oftentimes will enter into a program for elder care that would go from some sort of independent living to living that is, more supportive before they would head into having, you know, like 24-hour nursing care, essentially.
Okay, I'll take
So
that. So-
in those circumstances, those folks are actually, you know, that, you know, like, just like people can choose to live in a house or an apartment or whatever, those folks have housing arrangements. I don't believe that they would fall under a homelessness definition.
And so they are not a part of this.
So here, what is designed is the situation where there is some sort of a, you know, behavioral health or a physical health condition that is essentially contributing to that person being in a homeless state. Okay, so again, if it is possible for the family or the individual themselves to be able to provide for their own long-term, you know, living situation, then they're not going to fit that definition of homelessness. So it does come back to, again, it's this idea of we're focused with this particular ordinance with coming up with what types of services should be, you know, clarified and should be, you know, permitted in the city zoning ordinance to make it clear that folks who are providing these types of services have the ability to do that, and where and under what circumstances.
Joe, there's been several people that have served in the military that fall under this category too. So does the government feel that they should be obligated to help these people that have served in the military?
Are you asking about the federal government, or?
Yeah.
I don't know. That's beyond our scope. So,
because there's several people that have served in the military that have fall under this, you know, homeless and.
They may very well, and you know, we're trying to write it broadly enough that it can apply to. You know, it's not. You know, I don't think this. I mean, unless the council wishes to limit it only to, you know, like veterans or something like that, you know, certainly, you know, again, we're trying to write it in a way that, you know, individuals who meet this definition would be folks who would be able to be served in the community by an organization or, you know, some sort of a facility to do that, where otherwise, without that assistance, they would be homeless.
I follow.
Joe, we have a group here in Sedalia that's called Pettis County Community Partnership. They may fall under this, may or may not fall under this, what are support services. I know that with them, they help an individual who may become homeless without assistance. They help them with their first month's rent, or they help them with their rent, they help them with the deposit. During COVID time, they even had safer homes where they actually paid their rent for an entire year. So something like that would fall under the supportive services?
There's probably, well, we haven't gotten to supportive services yet, so
okay.
Let's not go there yet.
Okay, transitional house, okay.
So, but I guess one of the things I would point out to you is keep in mind, this is a zoning ordinance change, okay? One thing that we have to understand when we look at zoning ordinance changes is that when the law goes into effect, if there were services being provided previously, and they have now either, you know, now there's clarification and they're no longer permitted, or they're no longer permitted without a special use permit, that if those services were being provided prior to the adoption of the ordinance, they would qualify as a legal non-conforming use, okay? Sometimes people refer to that as grandfathering, okay? That is not true with respect to other, you know, police power type ordinances that we might pass that might include business licenses or nuisance code or something like that. Those, when you change those laws, they become applicable to everybody, regardless of how they were doing it in the past. They may no longer do that going forward. Now, we can't reach back in time to say, well, you were doing this before, now we've changed the law, you're in trouble for what you were doing before. That's called an ex post facto law, and that is not permitted under the Constitution. But when you change a police power law, or, you know, like something like a business license or nuisance law or something like that, it will be applicable to folks that were doing this before. We are focused on a zoning ordinance. So whatever changes that you might make to this ordinance would only apply going forward, okay? The other thing is, and something that I do want you all to think a lot about is the idea of a primary purpose, okay? I give this as an example. A grocery store's primary purpose is to sell food to individuals at retail. Because a homeless person walks into that grocery store and buys an apple does not mean they're providing transitional services of any sort. That's just simply a part of what their primary purpose is, okay? And there may be entities out there today that are providing a wide variety of services that some of those services may touch upon the things that are in this ordinance, okay? If they are not providing that service as a primary purpose, or if they are not taking the services that they provide and picking one lot on, in the city and saying, we're going to provide this service here and only this, that becomes the primary purpose for the use of that lot. Okay, but if an organization is providing a lot of services and it just so happens that some of those services touch upon, some of the transitional services, that doesn't make them necessarily applicable, they're not going to be subject to this ordinance.
Okay.
So those are two different concepts that both protect organizations that are potentially doing these services today, without the clarity.
Thanks for the clarification.
Mm-hmm.
What is the difference between our transitional housing and our permanent supporting housing, where Kelvin or whoever is in control of them, could you scroll up just a little bit? There was a requirement that said something about, maybe I misread it, requirement for seeking employment or a requirement for, I thought I read it in one of the highlighted areas, but no. Okay, well, the difference between a transitional housing or permanent supportive housing and a rental property.
Perhaps that it's in the actual ordinance itself, so I was going to try to open that real quick.
Where did I read through it? Shoot. Okay, yeah, it was in the ordinance, yes, thank you. That I had it pulled up on my laptop. Transitional housing, meaning residential facilities, the purpose of which to facilitate the movement of individuals and families experiencing homelessness and a permanent residence within 24 months. It may require a lease or occupation agreement, and use may include support services provided. So may require a lease or occupation agreement.
Okay. So your question was, again,
the difference between the transitional housing and the supportive housing, or transitional housing, since it may require a lease or an occupation agreement, and then a rental property, an organization owning a rental property and having the tenant under its own specific contract or individual contract with that organization and that property.
Okay, so the last part of that is probably the easiest to answer, okay? Because again, when we're talking about the provision of transitional services, right? So for example, transitional housing, the definition says residential facilities, the purpose of which is to facilitate the movement of individuals and families experiencing homelessness, okay? So homelessness is defined as an individual or family who lacks access to a fixed, regular, adequate residence, okay? So if you're moving from your mom and dad's basement to an apartment, you're not meeting the definition of homelessness. And I know that, I believe it's Mr. Shaw had some comments in some of the materials that we would recommend adding a definition related to homelessness that would address, persons experiencing homelessness. I believe that was the ad that you made, that you were suggesting, which I think is a good idea. So the difference between just a pure rental property and any of the transitional services, no matter which one you want to pick, are, the element that it is designed to help a person who is experiencing homelessness or is at the imminent risk of experiencing homelessness. Okay, so I think you asked that what is the difference between transitional and permanent?
No, transitional and the permanent versus a rental property.
Okay, yeah, again, it would be the fact that we're serving an individual who is either experiencing homelessness or is at imminent risk.
Ready? I got one. I just want to ask, and I think I know the answer. Well, I don't know if I know the answer, but so just kind of a yes or no for permanent supportive housing. And I'm then, you know, in the definition it says, and who was experiencing homelessness or was at imminent risk of homelessness. So this definition for us in this ordinance, permanent supportive housing, has to be someone that was experiencing homelessness or was at imminent risk of homelessness prior to moving into the facility, because of the word "and." Right? I mean, we're saying that's a condition. That is a condition that they have to be. That makes me not worry about some of the other things that Sedalia provides to the Center for Human Services and things like that. That's my question. And John's shaking his head yes. I think he's familiar with it.
Well,
I think he knows where I'm coming from.
I know what you're asking, and it's, does this affect like group homes
Right.
that the shelter shop has? And it's, no, this does not affect those because those are group homes allowed in R1 through our current ordinance.
And that will continue.
Yeah.
That's what I wanted to know, to a large degree. Thank you.
I'll move on then to support services. What are support services? Support services are on-site or off-site assistance to individuals or families aimed at reducing or mitigating the effects of homelessness, including but not limited to social, legal, advocacy, child care, employment, financial, health care, or information and referral services. We'll note that currently the definition specifically excludes the provision of meals, bathing, laundry, and overnight shelter, which has the effect of not allowing these services to be included at a facility designed to provide transitional services. The suggested intent of this definition is designed to provide a level of transitional services that falls between the very short-term and non-primary provision of shelter services, like a church or library providing temporary shelter, and the long-term transitional housing services that are like the transitional or permanent supportive housing, that is a facility that is designed with the primary purpose of serving persons experiencing homelessness and moving them into a situation where they are homed.
So we have support services existing now that are not aimed specifically at homeless people, that are people that are poor or are ill or whatever. You know, so do we need, I guess we do need to be specific in this case.
And again, I described earlier, again, if they are providing a wide variety of services, that some just happen to also be providing transitional services, then, you know, it's not going to be that primary purpose. You know, I do recommend that the council consider that we, you know, make it clear that it's a primary purpose, not just an ancillary service that is applicable to this ordinance if that's what you decide to go forward on. So the next question that we posed is what triggers a special use permit? under, we had already gone through the chart that shows, where special use permit is triggered. So the first bullet point, points out the fact that certain definitions specify that a special use permit is required for a use, specifically the definitions of each type of shelter. So it is clear I think in every place where an individual might look at whether they can provide shelter services in the city. If you look at the definition, if you look at the individual zoning district, and then if you look at the special use provisions, it is very clear that a special use permit is required for shelters in all three places. Each individual zoning district provides the uses that are permitted as of right or permitted with a special use permit. That is essentially the first two charts that we went through. And then the general list of uses that require a special use permit, which is City Code Section 64-124, lists all four types of shelters and the provision of support services in an R3 district. So that 64-124, if you were to look at the city code, you'll see it says these uses require a special use permit. And then it's a long list. At one point I had the number in my head, I think it's like 28 or something like that, where there were uses that if you want to put your property to this use in the city, you have to go through a special use permit process. And Mr. Simmons can correct me because he's more familiar than I am with the actual process itself, but I believe that the special use permit process does require, is it annual renewal?
No, it's ongoing.
Ongoing.
Yes.
Okay. No, so not the one that's proposed here, but normally.
Normally, no.
Normally it's ongoing. Okay.
It's ongoing.
So as Mr. Simmons was describing it, right now, if you have a use that you want to put to a piece of property in the city of Sedalia, and it is also on the list at 64-124, then in order to put your property to that use, there are additional regulations that are required. You need to go through a special use permit process, which is ultimately brought before the Planning Commission and then recommended for approval to this council.
Do you want me to explain the purpose of a special use permit? Sure. Okay. I was reviewing this earlier, and it came very clear that you all have questions about special use permits, and I think in the book itself, in 64-124, the first sentence of public hearing required, it says any of the uses in this section may be located in any district by special use permit of the city council after public hearing and after recommendation of P&Z, under such conditions as to the operation, site development, parking, signs, and time limit as may be deemed necessary. And this is the important part. In order that such use will not seriously injure the appropriate use of neighboring property and will conform to the general intent and purpose of this chapter. So it's a way to check in, an additional check, to make sure the neighborhood can support what is being proposed to be placed in that neighborhood. Does that make sense?
And adding on to that, typically where a special use permit is utilized is, again, if we're thinking of a normal R1 is the example that just comes to mind, a normal single-family use, then there's a characteristic that you would expect from single-family. We all can picture, the single-family house, the car, the garage with the cars parked in the driveway and so forth, okay? To the extent that a use that is put to an R1 property might be intensified, that is when typically a special use permit would be required. Do you have any examples of, I know back,
I think what came to mind while you were talking about that is somebody wanting to operate a bed and breakfast. Okay, a bed and breakfast can fit in R1, but we want to make sure it fits. What is the operation? What are they proposing? How many rooms? How many guests? Need to make sure that it still fits that neighborhood feel and it's not injuring the neighbor next door with excessive parking requirements or taking up all the off-street parking. We want to make sure that the intent of the district is being followed. Yes, a B&B can fit in, and we see that all across the country. B&Bs are in residential neighborhoods. But this is one of those checks to go, okay, let's make sure it
adding then to that is, so again, in that R1 example, where you would typically have a single-family house, most of us logically would say, okay, well, that's something that when someone moves there, they're living there long-term, matter of years, sometimes decades, where it's the same people, the same neighbors that you have over years and years. When you have a situation like the bed and breakfast, or, you've got the Airbnb, phenomenon and things like that, where you take that typical use and then you intensify it by having people coming and going and different people from time to time, that creates an intensified use. It's more traffic. It could be more parking. We've dealt, when I'm talking about, like the B&B, sometimes people will rent their houses out and it ends up becoming a party house or something like that. This is, again, this is an example of why, of special use permits. So then the question for you is, as you look at the provision of transitional services, are there things about transitional services that would say we should be more restrictive with the provision of certain types of transitional services? And that would, if your answer to that question is yes, there are some things we should be careful about, then that's where you would want to utilize a special use permit to allow that use to occur, but subject to rules. And it's something that we do all the time in other zoning districts for other uses, and it's something that's very natural to the city in that circumstance. In your packet materials, there are ample examples of articles that talk about the importance of being able to provide transitional services. There is a true need for these services, not only in Sedalia, but certainly across the country. There are articles that talk about the importance of being able to provide these services. But from time to time, depending on the intensity of that use, there can be problems that have been associated with the provision of transitional services. When you provide a greater amount or a greater concentration of transitional services, it is logical that you will draw a greater number of individuals needing those services. There are effects. We've seen nationwide, and you've got copies of reports that talk about the fact that, when folks are partaking of transitional services, if the services are ending late in the day, folks are then migrating to a place of, where they can find shelter, maybe in a nearby wooded area. You might have encampments that occur. There are issues with litter. There's, health safety issues with, where people are using the restroom outside, those types of things. And there are examples upon examples of cities that are forced with, either residents having to clean these issues, these kind of terrible side effects or unfortunate side effects that come with a greater population of folks that are, experiencing homelessness if they're camping, in kind of greater numbers, okay? As with anything else, if you've got a one-off, 1 or 2 or 5 people, it's probably not going to be a great effect. But if you have more people, there could be a greater effect. We heard testimony of that in the very first public hearing that this council heard. We received photographs of where individuals have defecated outside of, public buildings in the city of Sedalia. These concerns do exist. They are not non-existent. And again, so that is why, as this ordinance was proposed going forward, is to the extent that the more intensified the use is and the more potential it has for drawing in individuals that are in need and need these services and are having these services provided for them, that at least there be some safeguards put in place for the folks who are providing the services.
For the special use permit, is there a cost?
The cost on special, yes, there is. I'm trying to remember what the cost is. $350, but that covers, in our special use permit process, we have to notify everybody within 185 feet of just a special use permit. So that covers the cost of certified mailings, advertising the public hearing. It's really just to recoup the city's costs in considering the application.
And it's a one-time cost?
It's a one-time cost.
Okay.
John, I think it's important that we say again, just at public hearings, that's very important to me, that we get to have a public hearing with a special use permit so that people in the neighborhoods or wherever it's close to have a chance to come in to voice their opinion. I'm glad you said that. You reminded me of that. Thank you.
Another thing in the special use permit, you'll see in the existing ordinance, when I refer to the bed and breakfast, it goes further. There, of the 28 uses, 2 of them require additional information. Bed and breakfast do, they want to know the parking plans, they want to know those details of the business, and then mobile home parks also. So we have this precedent in our special use permit of saying, okay, we'll allow this with a special use permit, but we need this much more information.
So the last section that we have to cover in at least the practical application tool that we've created for you is also the largest one, but it does talk about what are the requirements of a special use permit. So again, referring back to the tables that you saw before, certain uses are allowed as of right, no special use permit required. Certain uses are prohibited in certain districts, they're not allowed at all. So this is dealing with in a circumstance where a use triggers the requirement for a special use permit, what are those additional requirements that we have been indicating?
Joe, is that currently in existence, or we're gonna add these if we pass this ordinance?
These, so
I couldn't find these in the current.
Correct. So the way that the ordinance is constructed at this point is you have in section 64-124, you have the list of uses in the city that trigger a special use permit. Okay. In section, I believe it's 125 and 126, you have special categories that have their own standalone requirements. Okay, so this ordinance would propose adding a new section 127 that would be the special use requirements for the provision of transitional services that trigger a special use permit.
Okay.
Okay. So so you see at the top of your screen there, it talks about we actually have it divided out into minimum standards. We have it divided out also into additional special use requirements for shelters are essentially the 2 sections that this divides out into. So the first bullet under minimum standards is that no facility subject to this section shall be located within 1,000 feet of a public or private school or licensed daycare. Such distance shall be measured by a straight line from the nearest edges of the property lines. This is an area that I think this council should stop and think about. Okay, this actually came about in the Transitional Services Committee, was passed through the Planning Commission, and is before you this evening. The original design was to have it be something similar to medical marijuana, and those types of uses kind of modeled off of that for both medical marijuana and alcohol or other areas of the law where these restrictions are put in place. A question for you on this is, do you need it at all? Do you want to take this requirement out? Do you want to leave it at 1,000 feet? Do you want to consider something between, 0 and 1,000? Do you want to go greater than 1,000? And so, do we have the ability to share the maps? Okay, so in your packets, you received copies of maps that address where shelters, and I think this is the one that's being pulled up now, where a shelter would be the beige is prohibited. Beige is prohibited. So I may have to take over and drive on.
Okay. If you could zoom in, Calvin, just a little bit so they can see a little more detail. The beige color is where the 1,000-foot radius of all licensed daycares with the state of Missouri, as well as schools, are located in Sedalia. So as you can see, in most of the commercial and industrial areas, there's just a few touches here and there. They're typically located in our residential neighborhoods anyway. So that precludes that with the way the ordinance is written. So you're really looking at what is the impact to our industrial zones and our commercial zones with the overlaps of those circles.
John, can you tell me you just said that the beige ones are cannot be
Prohibited 1,000
prohibited.
feet from an-
And then we have the dark purple areas
The darkest purple is M2 heavy industrial, the lighter purple is M1 light industrial. The commercial is the purplish color, and then the lighter versions of that are,
okay, you've got a green and you got a blue in there.
and then the green is CO, the light green and the green are CO, C1. The purple blue is C3.
So correct me if I'm wrong, John, that any place outside of one of those circles that is colored would be allowed.
Would be allowed per that matrix that shows, okay, like in your most of the white is all residential zoning. So like a shelter would not be an R1.
So any place in the white or inside the beige circle
Or inside the beige circle
would not be
would
allowed.
not be allowed.
Okay.
And it may be worth noting that if you have a property that is, well, if you can use a piece of property that, let's see, how do we decide that? That was distance, straight line from the nearest edges of the property. So like, for example, you'll see at Industrial Road and Broadway, there is that purple colored, you know which one I'm talking about?
Right here?
Yeah, that one right there. So there, it looks like a kind of a larger lot here that some of it is covered in the beige circle, a little too far, yeah. A little down a little further, there we go.
Where am I at?
Bring it to my finger, bring it down, other way, that's up. Bringing that down, right here.
Yeah, okay, yeah, that one there. So you can see that particular lot, portion of it is covered by the 1,000-foot circle. And again, if we're measuring property line to property line, so because a portion of that lot would be in the beige circle, then that entire lot would actually not be permitted. So partial lots, would
be turned off.
too difficult to be able to turn it off that way.
So where it crosses what is the back of, I think this is
Bakers, or,
setting and welding.
yeah,
This area here would be turned off because it's part of that property line that is touched by that circle.
So again, this map is shelters. Where shelters would be allowed, remember shelters are only allowed with a special use permit, okay? They are prohibited in certain districts, but they're allowed with a special use permit. Where you see it on the map, wherever there is a property that is shown in color that is not at least partially obscured by one of those beige circles. And that's with the 1,000-foot radius in place that has been proposed in the ordinance as it is passed along through this process. So I think likewise, we have a 750 that we could show if anybody's interested in seeing that. Or
I heard you say something about the white areas. Were you saying lots that touched a tan circle?
All of the white is prohibited already for shelter, according to that zoning matrix. Now, support services, there's also a map for that, and we'll get to that in a minute.
So, Councilman Bliss, if you'd like to look at the top of your page on
Yeah,
on that.
I figured it went back to that matrix.
So,
Okay.
so if you look here on the middle, we're talking about special use permits because that's the section that we're in. It's like, what are the requirements of a special use permit? The first bullet point was the 1,000-foot. So what we're trying to show you here is this map says that when so you can't do shelters in residential with a special use permit. In fact, it's prohibited, so you can't do it at all. In the CO, C1, C3, M1, and M2 districts, you can do a shelter, okay, but it is subject to a special use permit. The first requirement of a special use permit is you can't be located within 1,000 feet of a school or licensed daycare. So this, again, this map is designed to illustrate for you what does that mean then? again, a threshold question for you all is it even important? You know, do you want to see separation from shelters, from schools or daycares? You know, and ask yourself, is it important? If your answer is yes, then why? Why is it important?
I'd like to look at 2,000 feet, because I think it's very important that there's separation.
That one, we
did
can make a map.
Because, I mean, this is touching, some of these are in really close to neighborhoods in my ward, and I will just be honest, I have not had anyone that is a resident of city limits tell me they want a homeless shelter near their house. So my job as councilwoman is to represent them, and, you know, I know that it is important that we find balance, and our biggest job, I think, is to keep our residents safe and to feel safe where they are. So I'm here to advocate. You know, I need to advocate. We've got to find a balance there for sure, because I think our community is a very giving, loving community as well, and compassion is not lacking here in any way. But we definitely need to find some balance to do both, because I know when my people are telling me they're scared, then they're worried. That's my job, so that they don't feel that way. But I know we all want to help too. So, you know, 1,000 in my ward is not enough. I'd like more.
And Second Ward has the same concern as the Fourth Ward does, you know, where you're going to put this at. And that's one of the things that I really wish that along this journey that we were given suggestions, perhaps, from the community of where it could go that everybody is okay with, and everybody's not going to be okay with it, but, I mean, the majority of where it's going to be at. Another thing, I don't know if it's a question for here or a question for not, but let's say that we really couldn't come up with some place within the city limits. If whomever was to build this, and they said, okay, we're going to go out to the county, then we have no jurisdiction over that. So we wouldn't have to come up with the transitional services and what they can and cannot do, because we don't control county. So is that true? Am I right there?
I mean, specifically to, you know, does the city zoning power extend out into the county beyond the city limits? And the answer to that is no.
Okay.
From that standpoint, and, you know, so again, you know, remember, you know, at the outset of tonight's meeting is there is a big threshold question for you is, do you want to provide these services at all? Because if you don't want to provide these services at all, you know, it's a pretty easy fix. You just tell us that you don't want to do the ordinance, because right now we don't provide for transitional services in the city zoning code, and it's been my position that because of the city's permissive zoning, that transitional services are not permitted in the city without that. For what it's worth, I have seen a whole lot of testimony, though, in this last year that of people who are interested in providing services, and so I think that's, you know, a reason why we've worked so hard to try to find a way to provide services, but also balance it with.
Absolutely. I know that we have businesses and entities and individuals that are saying, hey, we're behind this, we're going to support this. So I totally understand that, but I'm just trying to wrap my head around, if you're not comfortable with what the city council is saying, this is this and this is what you're going to have to do if you put it inside city limits, then they also know, but if you go outside county, you don't have to have any of that, because we don't have jurisdiction outside county. So I'm just...
Right. The city zoning reach cannot go outside the county. It is my understanding that the county does not have zoning, so, you know, they're not, you know, anybody who would locate out in the county, it sounds to me, again, I haven't looked at this, and this isn't, you know, this is just, you know, for me, just making a basic conclusion to say that if there's no zoning, then they don't have a permissive zoning problem in the city, and so it should be permitted out there. You know, that's for a county attorney to decide.
Thanks.
Councilwoman Foster, you were saying you'd like to change this to 2,000 feet. Do I have a motion to change it to 2,000 feet?
A motion to change it to 2,000.
Do you want to change it, or you want to look at what 2,000 feet looks like?
I definitely think that 2,000 feet would be better than 1,000 feet, but yeah, I know it's probably not easy to just pop up, but we can't just make that.
No, I can't.
It's not.
It takes staff during business hours to do that. Do I have a second? And not having heard a second, the motion dies.
So looks like we have shelters now reducing down the kind of the beige circles that we've been talking about. This is what going the other direction would look like 500 feet. And again, we just ran 3 scenarios for you to kind of get a feel for if you decided to make an adjustment on this, kind of what it would look like. Unfortunately, yeah, sorry, we didn't go above the 1,000. I didn't think about that. So, but so again, looking at those beige circles, it does obviously open up additional properties. By way of example, the one that we pointed out earlier,
Which is right.
over here, right? Yeah, right there. Yeah. So now that lot that was it looks like there's actually a couple lots there potentially now that the circle has shrunk. That now that there are a couple lots that would now be available for a shelter with a special use permit on the west side of Industrial Road there that weren't available with 1,000 feet. So again, you can get a feel for what that means, and said we can go anywhere from deleting it to increasing it to really anywhere on that. And again, think about the reasons for yourself and as to why you think that would be important. What are the concerns that you would have with respect to wanting to put a limitation in that circumstance?
Yeah, it's a crystal ball type of deal here. We don't know who's going to apply to provide these services. We don't have any idea in a year or two how badly we'll need these services as our borders collapse and a variety of other things occur. I certainly don't want to give up this process just because we're worried about circles on a map right now. Whether they're 1,000 or 2,000 or 500, we need to continue on and look at this to some degree. That one particular place, we reduce it down to 500 feet and it doesn't touch that property line anymore, but
how long would it take for us to look at 1,500?
Mm-hmm.
How long would it take?
Yeah, I think that's John.
Well, I need to have our GIS person be available to do that. It's not difficult, but it's not easy.
Mm-hmm.
We could have it in a day.
Yeah, I know that I've been working with John to get these maps so that you could see this illustration, and we've had unfortunate circumstances where the GIS system conked out on Devin in the process, and it ended up taking days longer to get these maps produced to you than we originally had thought. And unfortunately, when we were going through the process originally, I think it was with the Transitional Services Committee, your GIS system was just down completely, and we never could produce the maps, at that point. So we kind of refreshed that recollection that was something that we wanted to show for this purpose, and so that's why they're here now. But,
it's easier to produce it. It takes, I can't do it tonight.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And again, thinking of that threshold reason. So here, what you're trying to do is you're trying to say we're going to limit down the ability to provide a shelter within 1,000 feet of a public or private school or a licensed daycare. So, again, I believe that the intent when that was originally, suggested was the idea that, where we have a public or private school or a licensed daycare, we're going to have a gathering of children in the area that may be playing in the area, walking or being transported in and out of the area, and that an intersection of children in that circumstance, and then the possibility of homeless individuals who may be more transient and who are migrating from, like a shelter to, you know, the place that they might make their evening or whatever, that, you know, could potentially, you know, cause a concern for you, you know. But you have to decide, is that an issue or not? Because if it's not an issue for you, then I would recommend you take it out.
Some of these properties, though, that are being touched, they might not be buildable anyway. There might be an existing structure, or the owner of the land is not gonna sell it, on and on and on. I mean, there's not just wherever the hand's not touching, it's,
Keep in mind too, that zoning is not about today, it's about future use also. That building could be gone in 20 years.
okay.
But your zoning code is in place. So you've got to think beyond your built environment today and what's past it.
And that's not to say that the zoning code couldn't be amended in the future. If you make decisions today, you can, you know, you or a future council could then make the decisions. But again, that would require, you know, a future council to do that, because you would be setting what the new law is for the city with respect to land uses for these types of uses until, you know, such time that a council might, you know, decide to do something different.
If you remember Councilman, Chris Marshall, his last name, I'm so sorry, when we went to Washington School, and they were talking about the possibility of building north for new schools. So
Correct.
I think we might just want to look at that 1,500 to make sure that we can spread out towards that area. With that being in mind, that there's a possibility, I strongly agree that we need to be able to provide services, but I also strongly agree that we need to watch out for our children, our daycares.
Yeah, I know that's true, Tina, I agree, but, you know, we shelter now at basically 3rd and Washington. And I don't know if there is a daycare, I don't know if we would be permitted, but I'm thinking about temporary warming and temporary cooling shelters. Those activities are going on, not really when school activities are going on, right? And I don't know of any issues that we've had close to that intersection at this point in time. So I'm kind of worried too when we're grouping shelters. That includes emergency shelters, temporary warming, temporary cooling. I would personally be not as concerned about temporary warming and cooling shelters as I guess I would emergency shelters. So that's another issue, you know. Are we just going to group shelters all together and then consider these radiuses, or are we going to look at it a little bit more closely?
So, we have a motion directing staff to create a 1,500-foot map and bring that back to council prior to the ordinance consideration.
I so move.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed?
No.
Clerk Meyer, please poll the council.
But can I ask a question real quick before we do that? Am I able to do that?
About this?
About this specifically. Are we wanting the 1,000-foot radius for shelters? Are we wanting that also, or the 1,500, are we wanting that also be for support services? Or are we just talking about shelters at the moment?
I'm just talking about shelters.
We're just talking about shelters, okay.
Hang on. So it would apply to support services, and there are maps to look at that. We have been talking about shelters. So again, so keep in mind that any use that is in this middle would be subject to the same 1,000-foot requirement as well.
Okay, so we would not be able to do two different radiuses for shelters and one for support services.
Yes, you could.
If you deemed, you know, if you have justification for why, you know, one might need a higher distance than another.
Put maps up on it, and you can use that with data however you want to use it.
Okay.
Hold the, council, please, Clerk Meyer.
Robinson? No. Oldham?
No.
Marshall? Yes. Vargas?
Yes.
Hiller is absent. Cross? Yes. Foster?
Yes.
Bliss? No.
Clerk, what's the count?
4-3.
All right,
One
motion
after.
passes. Motion carried. You could go ahead and prepare that.
Does it-
Please provide that map.
Wait a minute. Do we need 5?
No, it's not an ordinance, it's not.
Okay.
Correct, Joe.
I'm sorry?
It's not an ordinance, so
No,
it
no,
doesn't
this is
need
just a
five.
simple motion.
Yeah, okay.
Ordinances only require 5 affirmative votes on the final reading of the actual ordinance being approved.
Okay.
All right, we'll get that together and bring it back.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, moving on to the next bullet point. This one is actually, you know, just simply, I mean, this is a requirement of law anyway. This is a reminder for folks who are doing this that all facilities in the article must comply with underlying zoning districts. That's just something that staff would do, you know, as a part of the process, the application process. It would require a business license for all community residential facilities and shelter facilities. It would add, and again, so these are all, you know, what has been recommended as the requirements for a special use permit. So any of these are up for discussion, or I'm just going to go through them until someone stops me. But the next, the fourth bullet point would be for all facilities in this section, the Director of Community Development shall, upon the receipt of a permit application, report to the Planning and Zoning Commission and the City Council the neighborhood characteristics related to the use, compatibility, and physical character of the neighborhood in which the special use permit is sought. So you heard Mr. Simmons say earlier that very commonly for special use permits, what they're looking at is, does the use itself kind of exceed what the expectations are for a particular zoning district? And so as a part of that consideration, when the Planning and Zoning Commission will be looking to make a recommendation to this council, and then when this council, Mr. Simmons will provide you with a summary, because he will be required to by the ordinance, of what that is so that you can see a comparison. That's what that bullet point is about. The next subsection deals with space requirements. It says that residential facilities must comply with all applicable standards, including the International Building Code, International Residential Code standards. Again, these are requirements anyway, but it does make it a part of the special use permit. And I think maybe I'll just use this opportunity to kind of talk about how a special use permit, what its expiration date is. So when this provision about special use permits was originally introduced, there was an indication that every year, or the requirement was that every year a special use permit would need to be reapplied for. Throughout the public comments that we received, and I believe this was at the Transitional Services Committee, but we've had a lot of meetings, so I'm going to run them together, but I believe it was at the Transitional Services Committee, we had public comments that would make it very difficult for anybody who wanted to, you know, like essentially develop or to make an investment into a facility that might provide these services, that it would create uncertainty for them ongoing if they, every year, they had to reapply to make sure they could make the use. And that makes sense. If they needed to finance for any reason their facility, it would be difficult to get financing in that circumstance. So based on those comments, city staff revised that provision of the ordinance to essentially make it so that when an individual is required to receive a special use permit under this ordinance, they comply with the requirements that we are going through right now, and they are issued the special use permit. That special use permit will be in place indefinitely. Essentially, the idea is that every year, city staff will check, or if there are complaints that are lodged with the city, much like if someone had an R1 district and they started operating, you know, some sort of a used car lot on their R1 property, that someone, you know, a neighbor would likely complain, that if we get complaints, that we would investigate, we would look into it. But provided that a organization or a property owner was issued a special use permit under this proposed ordinance, that special use permit would stay in place so long as they are following all of the requirements of the special use permit. Additionally, there is a provision in the ordinance that says that if there's a situation where we do become aware that a property owner with a special use permit has violated the terms of the special use permit, that there is a notice requirement, and we allow them an opportunity to correct that violation. And then if they do not correct that violation, there will be a notice of public hearing, and that individual will be called in front of this council to determine whether that special use permit should be revoked at that point. So that was the compromise that city staff suggested in light of, you know, the public comments that we had received in the process of not making this an annual renewal process, but essentially it's a threshold renewal in order to get that special use permit to begin operations, and then that stays in place as long as the requirements are being complied with. Okay, so again, for residential facilities, they must comply with all applicable standards, including the International Building Code, International Residential Code. So the idea is that if they are in violation of the city's building codes, that is potentially a reason they could lose their special use permit. Confirmation that the building official, that the residence complies with applicable IBC and IRC provisions based on the number of people who may occupy the premises is required prior to approval of any permit in the section. And it does say that shelters must provide at least 50 square feet of space per person occupying the shelter. The idea being that, you know, you have basically, you know, enough room that you don't have people kind of stacked like cordwood on top of each other in a shelter, that there is, you know, room for, you know, adequate movement.
Did we cross that against the IBC and the IRC? That second? 50-foot
I'm
minimum?
not aware, no.
Okay. We should. And then can I ask you another question, Counselor? And I don't know if it's time yet or not, and I apologize. But if we have someone come to us and say they're going to provide a particular an emergency shelter, or temporary warming, or temporary and cooling shelter, do we document that? What happens if they want to provide additional services? They have to come back and modify their special use permit. Can you tell me how that would work, or is it here and I'm not seeing it?
Well, if they've added something, if we've issued a special use permit, they said they were going to operate I'm just working this through, but they said they were going to operate a temporary
Shelter.
And they come back and now it's got a day shelter component to it that wasn't there when they applied, and they had no mention of the day shelter. They're going to need to amend that special use permit and bring the new use forward to council, I would think, to get approval.
But I agree, but I'm not so familiar with the ordinances that I know that, do we need to add that, or is it already there? That's my question.
Well, they're not operating as they indicated on their special use permit application, so they're operating outside of their realm, which would trigger us to say you're operating outside of what you said you were going to do. So therefore, it kicks them into the public hearing process, and then coming back before council to go, hey, you're operating outside of what you said you were going to do. We don't have a problem with it, but you need to go back through the process and notify the neighborhood that you now have a day shelter in there or whatever other use.
I'm guessing that's already true if anyone was outside any of these 28 uses, and they went from one use. So that's already established.
Right.
Okay, thank you.
I mean, if they're not operating with what they said they were going to operate with, we're going to notify council of that.
Okay, that's what, I just want to make that clear.
And I think it's important to note that most zoning, you know, deals with, you know, scope of use, like what was it applied for. When you start to change uses that, you know, were originally there, you know, my example earlier was, you know, if you have a single residential family house and then you start using it as a used car lot, that's outside the scope of what that was approved for. And a special use permit just narrows that scope a little bit. So it's the same concept.
Okay. I'm just trying to get it clear in my mind.
Safety and maintenance. All residential and shelter facilities must continuously comply with applicable property maintenance codes established for residential and commercial structures within the city. Again, it kind of goes without saying because those are requirements that apply anyway. Code of conduct. All facilities must provide and enforce a written code of conduct which not only provides for the health, safety, and welfare of the temporary residents, but also mitigates negative impacts to neighbors in the community. Site access. All facilities except permanent supportive housing and transitional housing, which again, those are the closest that we would have to essentially, normal, not normal, but the common single-family residential use, must maintain a designated member to serve as a point of contact for the Sedalia Police Department. At least one member must be always on duty at said facility. The names of the currently on-duty members shall be posted at all times during operations. And it goes on to say, all facilities except permanent supportive housing and transitional housing must maintain a registry of all individuals being sheltered on that date, and such registry shall be made available to public safety officials upon request. So again, if you could imagine a situation where, it would be horrific, but if we had, 50 people in a shelter overnight and then some, like this facility caught fire, it would be a really good thing for the fire chief to roll up on the scene and be able to be handed a list of individuals who are there so they could check against that. If we have, concerns for safety and, maybe somebody is harmed or has personal property stolen or something like that, and the police are investigating, it would be good to, narrow down to who was present in the facility that evening. That's the concept there. Traffic. Traffic mitigation measures may be established for dwellings that are permitted as emergency housing or transitional housing for 15 or more residents, adults and children, plus managers and other service providers. So again, keep in mind that in R1, R2, and R3, these types of housing are allowed as of right anyway. So those actually would not apply in that circumstance. So look at that. We'll see. Yeah. So we would have that would be a situation where those would apply in the shelters and the emergency housing situation. So, managers and other service providers. Any residential or shelter facility housing more than 8 people must have an on-premises manager or sponsor at all times. The Director of Community Development may...
I got a concern there.
Sure.
Sorry. But, so residential shelters, advertise that, hey, it looks like we're going to have, we're predicting a temperature over 95 degrees, or we're predicting a temperature under, if I'm off by a degree, forgive me, 33 degrees. And 6 people show up at 7 o'clock. Again, if I get the times wrong, forgive me. And at 8 o'clock, there's 2 more, and at 9 o'clock, we go over 8. I mean, do they have to, how do they plan? I mean, why is 8 the magic number, and why do we need to even put a number? Why don't we just say any residential? I don't know if I'm getting too low altitude for the council, but that concerns me because I think it would be difficult for the people doing the sheltering to plan, because they have to call volunteers to get them to come in if they are going to use volunteers. But that one kind of caught me, so we might talk about that for a second.
So you're saying irregardless of how many people are there, they need a manager?
I know from experience with some of this that I think, and I don't want to speak for the people that are doing this, but I think they, and that particular number for the sheltering that goes on now, for, again, I don't want to speak for them, but I know that one night they may have 7, the next night they may have 15, and how do they plan for that if 8's the magic number? I almost think it'd be better if we just drop the, I mean, they could have 1 or 2 people there that are problem people, that could be more problematic than 15 people on on a particular night, because the people that come in to do this sheltering are not all,
Sure.
you know,
But I think they ought to have somebody in charge if they have two.
yeah, so that's what I'm saying, Jack. I mean,
Okay, that's what I'm asking. You're not, you don't want to specify 8 people, you want to have.
no, I think we just,
Specify a manager, be there.
I don't know if it's time to say that, but I would just say, I'd drop the 8 and say, if you're sheltering people, you need,
Yeah.
almost I would say that, but, I mean, you know, they may shoot me for saying this, but I just think that,
I think you ought to.
So do I have a motion on the floor to change the language to read, any residential or shelter facility housing people must have an on-site manager or sponsor at all times?
So moved.
second?
All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Thank you.
I couldn't get myself in trouble.
Yeah, Steve, that's a good point, because like you said, you know, when you have 8 people there and more come to you, lock the door and don't let anyone else in.
Well, and I'm sure if people are concerned, they'll ring us up and tell us, so it's okay. I mean, we're not passing the ordinance tonight.
Yeah.
Oh, I think you have a really valid point, though.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Counselor.
Okay, the next provision is the Director of Community Development may recommend to the Planning and Zoning Commission and the City Council a limit for the number of service providers, including volunteers and paid employees, and including both live-in managers and day workers, and require mitigation measures for emergency housing facilities and transitional housing facilities that use service providers to avoid impacts on the neighborhood and to ensure that the facility is consistent with the intent of the zoning district in which it is located and the character of the neighborhood. Any human services or training provided on the same premises shall be for the benefit of residents only. So again, this requirement is going to be specific to emergency housing, transitional housing, that are using service providers to come in that circumstance. Remember, emergency housing it's the more, it's not the provision of support services, right? It's actually, you know, where someone is staying for the shortest period of time overnight. And then the transitional housing facilities are that kind of that longer term, where, you know, someone may be staying for up to 2 years as they're, you know, trying to get their feet up under them so that they can get back into a more traditional housing situation. And so the idea is that if we've got folks that are needing services, that if we're driving traffic to the neighborhood where they are, as opposed to having them come to a facility to partake of the services, that would be something that the city would want to regulate, if that makes sense. So, you know, are we having much traffic coming out to the place where they're staying for these emergency housing or transitional housing facilities? And I'm just going to say, now that I'm kind of piecing it all together again and looking at this, so keep in mind, this is a special use permit requirement. So the emergency housing, transitional housing in an R1, R2, R3 district are all permitted as of right. And so this requirement probably would be better protection for folks in the residential districts, because where a special use permit would apply for emergency housing is just the M1 and M2 districts, which are industrial. So maybe the traffic there isn't a concern. Same thing with transitional housing. It's permitted by a special use permit, CO, C1, and C2. Again, that's commercial, so it may be better suited for some additional traffic. So this wouldn't really affect a situation where it's a residential neighborhood and, you know, the traffic, you know, may not be as necessary. So, you know, if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, when you boil it down, look at it, it is necessary.
Where are you guys? I got lost. I'm sorry. But I was,
Bottom of page 3.
you're all the way down to the bottom of the additional special use?
Look on your screen.
Okay,
That's
thanks.
Councilman, at the very top there.
Okay, you're not too worried, okay, I'm sorry. I'm gonna make a point further down. Go ahead.
So considering what I just pointed out, do you think that's anything of importance, or is that something you might be interested in having a strike?
I'm sorry, what is the purpose of limiting limit for the number of service providers? What, again?
It would essentially get at the amount of traffic being driven to the location where the services are being provided. You know, you have multiple individuals that might be partaking of the services. If you've got, service providers there, or you've got, maybe on a daily basis, folks who will be coming in and out to provide services, as opposed to these individuals in the emergency housing or the transitional housing going to a facility where those services are provided. But again, as I'm looking at this and remembering that, it is permitted as a right in the R districts, and it's only an issue in the M1, M2 for emergency housing, and the C districts for transitional housing, that may not be a concern any longer, because those are more heavily trafficked areas anyway, and they're more intense uses, not the lower intense uses like residential. So it may not be necessary.
Well, but let's err on the side of caution. I don't want a bunch of traffic in residential areas. I think I'm hearing you say, Joe, that you're not concerned because the residential areas aren't affected.
Well, what I'm saying is that keep in mind that we are in the special use permit section. So it's when a special use permit is triggered, what applies. But the point I'm trying to make here is that for emergency housing and transitional housing, they are both permitted in R1, R2, and R3 districts as of right. So they do not trigger the special use permit requirement, so that would not apply. Now, if that caused you to say, hey, as a matter of fact, if we're providing emergency and transitional housing in R1, R2, R3, we may want to, add some sort of maybe move this requirement to those districts specifically for that particular use. That may be something that you would be interested in. But, again, as I'm looking at this and, piecing it all together with the framework, it does occur to me that this may not be a necessary requirement for a special use permit in a heavily, more intense use area like commercial and industrial.
What if there are permits that housing people would conflict in that, industrial permits with regards to, wastewater things? Brenda brought that up whenever we were in the, zoning session, that there might be areas where if you were housing people, it would conflict with somebody else's permit with regards to DNR.
Yeah, so you may recall that at the early outset of these discussions, certainly with the Planning Commission, I pointed out the fact that in addition to permissive zoning, this city has completely cumulative zoning. So unless you're ready to undo cumulative zoning and make it so that you can't have residences in an industrial district, that's just going to be something y'all are going to have to live with.
We called it unnesting earlier in the process, didn't we?
I don't remember.
Were we talking about nested or not nested?
I don't remember that term.
Maybe I was just reading.
But right now in your industrial districts, virtually, there kind of almost is no zoning because, other than what's not listed in the permissive, there's little requirements. You can build a single family house in the heaviest industrial district if you prefer.
No.
I'm sorry, that's right. It's too far. A bridge too far. M1 is the highest you can do that. M2 you are prohibited from residential, yes.
So traffic should be expected in the areas that this section is speaking about. And so because it's expected, because of its intended use, this really has no bearing or shouldn't have a bearing. Is that?
I mean, it's it's really a question for you to answer, right?
That's how I understand what you're saying.
Right, but yeah,
The
so,
special use that can be applied to that specific area should already have an expectation of traffic, so this really has no bearing being in that.
just an overarching concern with zoning is we are trying to, to take uses that may be more intense and kind of focus them to areas that are typical for intense
So
use.
this would be better down the line, we make it towards residential uses, is that correct?
Right, so if you have a concern, if you agree that this would be a term that would reduce traffic in certain areas, where, maybe people are coming out to provide services to folks who are in emergency housing or transitional housing. And again, since those are permitted as of right in residential, if you would want to reduce traffic in the residential areas, then yes, the move would be to, have staff amend this in a way that maybe this provision goes away in this section, but that we do add some sort of protection in the residential districts that would address a concern for increased traffic and to try to, keep that at a minimum.
I would make that motion. If you have a good way of wording it for me, Counselor, I would make that motion.
I think it would be essentially to modify the proposed ordinance in a way to remove the traffic considerations under managers and other service providers and fold it into the residential requirements.
So moved.
Second. All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed?
All right, motion carried.
So I have a question, please. So with transitional housing and permanent supportive housing for as of right in residential, should we be concerned with too many of those in certain areas? Should we consider putting that under a special use permit so that we don't get one whole neighborhood that's just taken over with all of that? I know there's a lot of ill effects from that when reading some of the studies. I don't know.
In about 2 bullet points, we're going to get to that very topic.
Okay.
Okay, if that is all for managers and other service providers, then we'll move into the last 2 of the minimum standards. The first deals with drugs and alcohol. The use of alcohol, recreational, marijuana, and controlled substances except by prescription is strictly prohibited on facility premises. So again, if a special use permit is required to make use, then they would have to prohibit alcohol and drug use at that facility. If there are no concerns, then moving on to the last one, this is essentially what Councilmember Foster was looking at or was asking about, is dispersal of like facilities. And this is specific then for all emergency housing facilities and transitional housing facilities permitted subject to the provisions of this chapter. The Director of Community Development shall, upon receipt of an application, report to the Planning and Zoning Commission and the City Council the existence and locations of like facilities to avoid approval of permits for like facilities within a single neighborhood. So this restriction addresses exactly what Councilmember Foster was asking about, and generally, as a matter of consideration for the Planning Commission and this council, when you are making changes to zoning requirements, a piece of that is to protect against the overuse, essentially, of a particular use in a zoning district. So I have another client who has had a large number of used car lots move into a particular area to the point that they have completely taken over. And so that is something that Planning Commission is sensitive to when another application for a used car lot may be coming in to rezone something, because it just creates too much saturation of one kind of use or another, in that circumstance, a used car lot in a particular district. And so they, when there is a request for a rezoning that would permit that, that is something that they can look at. Likewise here, if it was a situation where there's already ample services being provided in the community and it was likely, having additional services start to be provided, and again, this is for emergency housing facilities and transitional housing facilities, that there would be the ability through the ordinance that the planning commission or the city council could say, no, we've got enough in this area.
But isn't this like the other?
Yeah.
This won't get triggered because it's a special use permit.
Does not require the special use permit, though.
So it won't,
So
it
it's
won't
not.
handle those.
Well,
Right.
again, it would apply, in this circumstance, it would apply if you didn't want to have too much emergency housing in the M1 or M2 district, or too much transitional housing in the CO, C1, or C2 district because of the way special use permits apply.
But they don't have to get a special
They
use
don't have to
permit.
get a special use permit.
They do for those districts that I just listed. So if you look at the second box, right, we're talking about emergency housing and transitional housing, correct? So a special use permit is required in M1 and M2, a CO, a C1, and a C2. So this requirement would apply for special use permits in these areas. But it does not apply, likewise, to the one that we just discussed. It does not apply in the residential district. So that would be, potentially another one that you could move.
That's what I'm
But
talking
wouldn't
about.
be that, we'd be the most concerned about residential, I would assume. I mean, so I think that we need to look at moving
Yeah, I would suggest
those
moving.
to down from as of right to special use permit. Because I don't understand how
So
we check it.
one approach would be to take the residential and put it in the special use permit requirement for those uses. Or the motion that Councilman Oldham made on the last issue was to say, take it out of the special use permit requirements and make it an additional requirement in the residential. We could do a similar thing where
That's what
these uses in a residential district, shall be subject to, that type of a limitation.
Do I have a motion?
So moved.
Second.
So that motion would be to remove the dispersal of like facilities provision that is as listed for emergency housing facilities and transitional housing from the special use minimum requirements and moving it into a residential protection.
I mean, point of clarification, would you want it in both?
Oh, so leave it in the minimum requirements on the special use permit, but also add a provision for it in the residential use section.
If it's not redundant, if it's double protection, yeah, I can see that.
Well, if you only move it, then when you get to M1 or CO, C1, and C2, then it wouldn't apply. If you only apply it to residential. So, I'm not advocating either way, I'm just saying, which way do you want it? Do you want it to always apply? Or do you just want it to apply to residential?
I think it should always apply.
Always apply in the circumstance where a special use permit is triggered versus.
Or if you put it in both, then it would be also in residential where it is as of right.
I agree.
So do you want to move it or add it?
I want to
So adding it covers everything.
Adding it covers everything. I would add it.
Because we want to definitely be sure that residential is covered.
So do I have a motion to add?
So let's do a motion to amend the motion on the floor to add protections of dispersal like facilities to residential districts, but essentially keep it in the minimum standards for special use permits.
So moved.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Okay, that was the motion to amend, and now a vote on the amended motion.
Vote on the amended motion. Well, do I need a motion? No, but I need a second. We never got a second.
No, we amended the motion. So now there's a new motion pending.
Okay.
They did a motion to amend what was pending, okay? Now there's a new motion pending that needs a vote.
Okay. All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Thank you.
Okay, this is the last section for the standards for special use permit. These are additional SUP requirements for shelters. So for shelters where the SUP is required, and that would be the CO, C1, C3, M1, and M2 districts, the facility shall have on-site supervision during all hours when the shelter is open. Facilities shall provide exterior lighting on pedestrian pathways and parking lot areas on the property. Lighting shall reflect away from all residential areas and public streets. Facilities shall provide secure areas for personal property. Shelters located in the city's residential zoning district, that is actually none. So that can actually, I would recommend that that be deleted.
That doesn't reconcile with this, right?
Yeah.
Yes, that's one thing.
Yeah, there's not any shelters in.
So do we need a motion?
I mean, the third box, shelters are prohibited, the third.
Right.
Yeah,
Yep.
in R1, R2, R3, so that, yeah, that's.
So what you could do with this provision is either delete it because it is no longer applicable because the way that the zoning ordinance was amended, that it ultimately shelters are not permitted in a residential district. The question would be is do you still want a maximum of 40 beds requirement or not? If you don't want one at all, then we strike this. If you like a 40 bed maximum or some other number of bed maximum, then you could vote to amend this to apply in other circumstances.
I think 40 beds is a lot. I don't know, Steve and I were just kind of talking a little bit.
Where did that come from?
Yeah.
How did that ever get there?
Are those king size beds or
I mean,
single size beds?
well, only you would.
Well, it makes a difference. That's a lot of people.
40, a facility housing 40 people in a residential area.
Shelters.
And the shelter, so it wouldn't be in a residential, it'd be just in.
I was gonna say, that should be struck because there's no shelters located in the city's residential.
Right. That's what Joe's saying, but then I didn't quite follow you, why you.
But so my question is, if this provision, as written, does not apply the way the rest of the ordinance is written at this point in time, okay? Remember, this is iteration upon iteration of drafts, right? But as it's written today, right now, shelters in residential zoning districts shall not exceed 40 beds. Well, they're not allowed at all, so that doesn't matter. The question to you is, do you want any sort of a limitation on shelter beds? Because where shelters are permitted, do you want to limit the number of beds or not? If not, then we strike it completely, and if so, if there's a number that you like better than 40, or if you like 40, we leave it at that. You leave it at that.
I've got a comment. So in my mind, I'm thinking about all the work that occurred before we worked with this, and there were a lot of people that knew what they were talking about. That's why I asked where did that number 40 come from, because do you recall in the process of planning and zoning or the committee that was appointed, is 40 some type of number that's required at some state or federal level? Where did 40 come from? It seems
it was a recommendation, and I believe it did. The genesis of it was from the Transitional Services Committee, and it's kind of come along through the process.
So to me, that seems large if it doesn't get us in a bind. I'd at least, even in the other areas.
What do you think a good number sounds like?
I kind of hate picking a number right now.
Again, you're the legislature. You get to pick the number. But, what I ask you to do as you pick a number is tell me why. Why is, if you're going to make the number smaller, then what is it about 40 that concerns you, and why would you want to make it not a smaller number? Or if 40 is too low a number, if you want to make it a larger number I guess I went the wrong direction.
So we're not.
You want to change the number, say why.
Okay, I'm getting there. So residential, it seems exorbitant. If I'm not going to put 40 beds for a shelter in a residential area because
that's off the table.
I know it's off the table. Let me finish. But we're talking about, I think, C1, C0, and I'm trying to look at the matrix and tell you which areas we're talking about. And and it could be that in commercial areas, if we have that, especially, I know C2 is not listed here, and if I recall correctly, C2 is upstairs downtown, but if we start putting a facility, for instance, in that area with 40 beds, you know, again, I'm not worried about the temporary shelters too much, but
Permanent.
So what I would, so if you have your chart in front of you, so what we're talking about is the middle chart,
okay.
shelters only. So you're only talking about a special use permit requirement that would apply to a shelter that is allowed in a CO, a C1, a C3, an M1, or an M2 district. There is no C2.
Okay,
in
yeah, well, I know
for
that there is a C2, but it's not,
It's not permitted.
yeah, okay, but, I mean,
So focusing on where, I think it was Kelvin that was kind of circling with.
so, yeah, so I guess,
So,
you know,
those areas, yeah.
if it's commercial and industrial, 40, I don't mind, 40's okay.
And you don't have to put a limit at all.
I think you definitely need a limit. I think 40.
Okay, I'm gonna take 40, you can reduce it if you want to.
Does anybody else
Pressure's on
think
you.
40 seems like a lot? No?
In those particular areas.
Do you guys want to have a restriction at all?
Make a motion,
Okay.
or put a.
I'm sorry, I'm thinking about if you have a facility that's going to take in families as well as single individuals, you could have a family of 5.
Right.
So that's part of that 40 number.
Yeah, and so you're saying the traffic wouldn't be as great there because it's a family of 5 and there's maybe one vehicle, or, that's a good point.
So how do we specify that? Because that's a different, I definitely agree with you that 2 parents and 3 kids is different than 5 adults. You know?
I think the first question you need to address is right now, this line applies to nothing.
Mm-hmm.
And if you want it to apply to something, then there needs to be a motion to strike the residential part of it and make it apply to all shelters.
I think, Mayor, on that one, because it's not applicable as written, that can be general consensus, that we would have to take out the phrase located in the city's residential zoning districts, no matter what. Because right now, it can't apply as written unless you want to go back and change that. So if the general consensus of the council agrees with that, then we will make that strike because it can't work that way under the current construction. What that leaves you with then is language that reads as this: shelters shall not exceed 40 beds, provided that such shelters must otherwise comply with the underlying zoning districts. So then the question is, when there is a shelter, would you want it to have more than 40 beds in any circumstance? Or is 40 beds a good limit, or do you want no limit at all on the number? I guess I said that already. More than 40, you know, anything greater, or would you want something less than 40?
Let me at least get it started. I'll make a motion that we strike the residential phrase and that we leave the limit at 40.
Second. All those in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Okay, moving on. Now the number.
I think he said leave it at 40, so that was covered.
Leave it at 40.
He said strike residential and leave it at 40, so we're good.
All right.
Did you guys understand that? Did I say that clearly? Okay. Well, I didn't want to.
Yeah, you got it.
Okay.
And you know,
I'm trying.
you did. So the next requirement is, or the restriction is, the shelter shall provide on-site parking at a rate of 2 spaces per facility for staff, plus 1 space per 6 occupants allowed at the maximum capacity. So I recall that the discussion on this in either the Transitional Services or the Planning and Zoning Commission was that, you know, while sometimes homeless people may actually, you know, be living out of their car, so they will have vehicles, there are also many situations where homeless individuals are even without a vehicle. So I think that's why they were saying is there has to be adequate parking for everybody so that they're not parking up streets and blocking, you know, alleyways and so forth, or whatever the case may be. But that keeping in mind that there may be, customers, I guess is one way to say it, of the facilities that won't need transportation, so you don't need to make the parking, you know, huge. Like, that's the 1 for 6 is why that came about.
So why not let the line just read, provide adequate parking? Why get specific? I mean, that's on a couple of these, like there's
I
one
agree
out
with
there that said, must provide space for personal property. Why are we getting so specific with how we feel they should run their organization? I'll leave that open, not just you, but open
to
to
some
council.
extent, there then becomes a question of is then how does if somebody complains, if somebody says, there's not adequate parking here, well, how does your code enforcement officer go out there then and say, well, you're right, it's not adequate? So to have some specificity, at least at that, there's something that for your code official to measure off of when enforcement is necessary.
Do we provide specificity with hotels or with restaurants?
Yeah.
Or
We do.
We gotta do it all the time.
Okay. Yeah.
Very common in zone.
This number here is actually allowing for less parking than would have been allowed for like a retail business or a restaurant or et cetera, because you're anticipating 6 occupants per vehicle.
So we're making it comparable to
a homeless population that may not have the car. So why would we require a parking space for every one? So it's less than the parking requirement.
Also, I think keep in mind that some shelters, like in an emergency shelter situation where ultimately it would be an accessory use, then they're going to be subject to their own parking requirements. Like I believe that churches are required to have so much parking, restaurants and so forth. So
we are though providing the same standard as we would provide towards any other facility.
And recognizing the lighter.
And making it comparable.
And the flip side of it would be is if you have an organization that wants to create as a primary use a shelter, there are going to be parking requirements for them as well, just like there are every other business, but it's recognizing the fact that many of their, consumers of their services may not have a car, and so it's actually making less of a burden for an organization that may want to provide this as a primary source, a primary service.
All right, let's move on.
Okay, the last requirement is a management plan is required for all shelters upon submission of an application for a special use permit pursuant to this article to address management experience, good neighbor issues, transportation, client supervision, client services, and food services. Such plan shall be submitted to and reviewed by the Community Development Department, and a recommendation made to the Planning and Zoning Commission and City Council prior to the approval of such special use permit. The plan shall include a floor plan that demonstrates compliance with the physical standards of this chapter. Such operations plan shall become a part of any approved special use permit, and the special use permit shall stipulate that continued compliance with the operations plan in this section is required for continued operations of the special use. The Community Development Department shall inspect at least annually each emergency shelter to ensure compliance with this section. The City Council may establish a fee by resolution to cover the administrative cost of review of the required management plan. So this gets back to that kind of expiration date that we talked about before. In addition, they're going to create a plan that lays out how they intend to provide the services that they wish to provide. And so they're going to tell the Community Development Department, they're going to tell the Planning Commission, they're going to tell you when they come in to apply for a special use permit, how they intend to provide the services. And then that will be the kind of the rules that they essentially kind of set for themselves going forward in order to keep the special use permit in place. If they begin to exceed the scope beyond what they said they would do, then they're in potential violation of their plan, and could be subject to potential revocation, or, you know, as we discussed before, they might be able to seek an amendment to address, you know, changed plans that would, you know, still have to be approved. But provided that they are following the plan that they have submitted and was approved for them, they continue on with that with no need for an annual renewal, but they do need to allow for annual inspection by the city.
Do we require a management plan for other special use permits? Do we require a management plan for other special use permits, for those who?
Well, as I said earlier, for bed and breakfast, we require additional information. You know, how many guest rooms, how many,
Right.
those things, but there's no provision for what you're asking now,
There's no provision in those special use permits like
for an
that.
operations plan.
Do those special use permits have the stipulation that the city council may establish a fee by resolution, et cetera?
I just unmarked that page in the book, but let me get to it.
While he's looking, generally, the council has the ability to impose administrative fees when there will be an additional cost for the city to administer a program to help offset, so that individuals who are partaking of the program pay those costs rather than the taxpayers at large.
For example, in mobile home parks, there is a clawback. If they haven't built out a mobile home park within 24 months from the date of the issuance, council can claw that back.
If they have not built it.
Remove all the mobile homes within 6 months. If they didn't say what they were going to do, what they said they were going to do in mobile homes, council can unwind that. Bed and breakfast. No, they're just asking that they have sales tax, city business license, any interior modifications, are within the building code, and that they have a floor plan. There's no clawback in bed and breakfast, but there is in the mobile home park.
And keep in mind, just for a moment, that what is the reason we talked about why do cities utilize special use permits? Because certain uses may be a little more intense than others, and you develop special uses that can be different for a different type of use because a use might create special concerns. Again, I will refer you to your packet materials. The provision of transitional services does, from time to time, create kind of ill effects in the area. We have seen examples of this in Sedalia. There are examples of this nationwide. You don't have to wait for the problem to come to you in order to regulate it. So if you have concerns that particular uses may drive traffic to the area, and we're aware that the traffic might create litter, might create health, safety, welfare issues with, you know, public defecation or urination or things like that, this is the place that you have the ability as a council to say, we want to protect against that. You know, when you have members of the community who come in and say that they're fearing for their safety, how do you address that? You address it in a management plan. How can you say that a particular user, depending on the use they want to put it to, how do we ensure that the neighborhood is protected? That, you know, if individuals coming to the services ultimately migrate to other areas of the city, will the service providers that have drawn them there in the first place have a hand in helping clean up, or is that the responsibility of the taxpayers to pay that, you know, when your codes officials and your police department have to go out and take care of it? So, you know, again, look at that information that you were sent, you know, for the background information, because those are the issues that communities across the country face when these types of services are provided. Are these types of services required? It's not my call. It's your decision. I will tell you, absolutely, I think they are. We have people in the community that are suffering and that need these services. But it's naive to think that the provision of these services, especially when it's good provision of these services, doesn't create a collection of individuals to come in and utilize those services, and that there aren't ill effects. That's completely naive to think that that's not the case. Here's your opportunity to say, we are able to provide these services in our city, but we want to make sure that that the folks who are providing those, if there are ill effects, that there is at least a way to ask them to help with the cleaning those issues up.
I believe a management plan needs to be in place. You need to say what you're going to do what you say you're going to do, and be open to allowing the city to come in and do inspections when they need to do it. I just, you need to know that floor plan. I think that's a plus for our fire department. They've got that floor plan, so if something happens, they can go in there.
Well, I agree with Tina. I mean, remember too, we're partnering with these people to provide a public benefit. This is not a private corporation like a trailer park. We've got to have some type of idea from these people what they're going to provide, so that we can work as a council to find the other services that a particular, we're putting together a bunch of puzzle pieces here and trying to create a complete area of service. I would say that I would like to know who, what, when, where, and how. And this paragraph doesn't really give me all of that information. I want to know who the principal people are that are involved, who the officers are. I want to know what type of, if they're a sole proprietorship or a partnership or how they're registered with the Secretary of State. I want to know, when they're going to be up and running. Of course, this is a lot about this, where they're going to be located and how they're going to do that. Are they going to be privately funded, or are they going to be a mixture of, and not to be overly nosy, but within the confines of knowing the information that we need to know as a city council and as a city to make sure that they are legitimate and that they are fitting within our overall plan.
I don't feel like we're being nosy. I feel like we're being responsible.
That was a poor choice of words. I think, that was a poor choice of words. That we've got some level of responsibility to know who, what, when, where, and how too. So I'd like to add to this a little bit about, at some point, that who the principal people are involved, if we can ask that or require that in that management plan, because I don't see it. It may be in there. I've read through this twice, but I'm not specifically seeing in that list that was there. I'm sorry, I took my glasses off. This article addressed management experience, good neighbor issues, transportation, clients, supervision, client services, and food services. I'd like to know who the officers and the people are that are involved in this. I guess to me, what means how they're, what type of business they're going to be, how they're going to be registered with Secretary of State. All right, is the business license required? Yes. Well, some of it would be, but I don't think all of it would be. A business license, you don't have to.
Yeah, I think it is, because shelters are not allowed anywhere where they're not subject to a special use permit. And if I remember right,
business license.
The minimum standard says business license required for community residential facilities and shelter facilities. So it is actually not required for a shelter under the minimum standards for an SUP. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're not subject to a business license otherwise, but it's not covered in this SUP that they would get that.
So I have to admit, I'm not completely familiar with everything that's required on a business license.
Yeah, it says the business license is required for all community residential facilities.
And shelter, I'm sorry, absolutely right.
So that
Sorry, one day. It would be required, I apologize.
Yeah. If it tells me who the officers are, I think it would tell us how they're registered with Secretary of State.
I'm more concerned, just make sure that registered with the state and who their board of directors. That's what you're referring to.
I don't want to have somebody that we behind the shadow. I want to know who's running these. If I can legally know that.
So what happens 2 months down the road, that person moves and we get a new person. And 2 months later, that person moves and we get a new person. I think if we have a general management plan to something as specific as knowing who the individuals are would be more beneficial and less in the weeds. You have your business license.
I disagree. I think we need to know who's applying. But the business permit would give us that, he's applying.
So you'll have your identity, your receiving person identified with the business license. You'll have your person identified, who was one of the stipulations earlier, you have to have one identified person.
Yeah, and maybe,
Facility, but.
and also, Councilman, I think maybe they, correct me if I'm wrong, they apply with business license, we find out how they're registered with Secretary of State, we can drill back there and see who the officers are, so I think that answers it.
I want to provide an ordinance and a special use permit that will be able to apply the support services we need without us having to run the business. We don't need to run the business for them.
No,
We just
No,
need
but
to
we
be
need to
able
make sure
to help
people
provide
have-
them the facilities too.
Point of clarification, we don't look up the Secretary of State who the board members are for business license. So if you want to make that a requirement, you'd have to add that, because we currently don't. We check to make sure that they have a no tax due, which means that they have to be, in good standing with the state. But we don't check to see who the board.
it's public information, right?
Yeah, but we don't routinely check it, so.
I agree with Councilman Bush. I believe that whoever is running this facility, we ought to know who they are, so that if something comes up, we know who to contact, who to go to.
Again, it's not just a commercial situation. This is a public benefit type situation, and we've got a team with them. We're teaming with somebody. I kind of want to know who it is, just to a broad degree. So I'll make the motion that, yeah, you check with this particular situation we have, that we require business license, and we look at the Secretary of State filing to see, if nothing else, that means they're legitimate, right? So I got a motion on the floor.
On the permit.
So I guess with respect to your motion, Councilman, the requirement for a business license already exists in this ordinance as written.
And then, so the second part would be that the staff look for public information with regard to the Secretary of State. They're gonna give us a name, you know, Acme service provider.
So what do you do with that information once you have it?
I want to know that they're, well, and I probably didn't listen to Kelvin really well. He said that we do check to see about their tax status.
Yeah, we check their tax.
So
But if you're wanting to know who the officers are, we don't check that.
so we know their tax status, that means they're a legitimate, that gives them some legitimacy, right?
Yeah.
Well, so I think, you know, point of clarification on that is, what is required by state law to issue a business license is we have to check with the state to make sure that taxes have been paid. We're precluded from issuing a business license to someone who has not paid their taxes, okay? If it is a tax exempt entity, then that's not going to apply. So, I mean, I don't know about, you know, certainly if they are in good standing with the state and they have paid their taxes, if they're required to pay their taxes, that is an indication that they are, you know, a valid entity. But, you know, with respect to, you know, the checking of no tax due or anything like that, that would not apply to a nonprofit that was submitting on this.
Well, they don't have to be a nonprofit.
I didn't say that. What I'm telling you is that you're, you know, if I couldn't even tell you what the assumption would be. If half of the businesses that might provide these services are nonprofits and half are profits, you're only going to get half the information you're asking for.
So if you're wanting to know who the officers are, then we would have to add that to this. So if you're wanting to know that, then you would want to make a motion to add to the application who the officers of the organization are.
Well, not necessarily the officers, but your contact people. That's what I'm saying. If you have a question, who are you going to contact? Who do you talk to? If we don't have any names, how do you know who to talk to?
Well, you'll have a business license application.
Your point of contact would be the individual making that, application.
On the business one.
Well, and part of it is management experience, so you're gonna have to know who the management is to know their experience, right?
And if there's an issue in the middle of the night, public safety is gonna have a point of contact.
That's somewhere up in here.
Mm-hmm.
So I just think we're just kind of getting into in the weeds with something like this.
I didn't see that point of contact, so.
All right, so the question is, you wanna know if this person is a felon or?
No, I just wanna know if I'm dealing with a corporation in New Jersey, or if I'm dealing with, nothing nefarious, but I wanna know if I'm dealing with a group from outside our location, or if it's a group of people from our area that are trying to do something good for our community. That's all I'm saying, because believe it or not, there are organizations that make money off of homeless, providing these types of services. And I'm not even opposed to that, necessarily, but I just want to know who I'm dealing with.
Councilman Marshall just showed it, under the site access, it says that, all facilities except permanent supportive housing must maintain a designated member to serve as a point of contact. And, that's for the police department, so, of course.
Yeah, I understand the point of contact, but I'm saying I want to know, and really, if it's not an issue, for me, it's kind of an issue. I want to know who we're dealing with, not just an individual here in Sedalia that's a point of contact, but I want to know if we're.
Councilman Bliss, there will be a public hearing. Those people would appear, I would imagine, at the public hearing if they're interested in their special use permit being approved. It's where you could query them.
All right. All right, that's fine. I just brought it up. I don't think the council, as an overall group, is concerned, so let's move on.
Well, I mean, there was a motion made. Is there a second, is the question. There was a lot of discussion without a second.
Yeah.
Well, the motion was, I made, that was to have staff check with them. Of course, really, if they're with the Secretary of State to see if they're filed as a entity in the state of Missouri. If they're filing as a corporation or filing as an individual. I'm more concerned about corporations and not-for-profits. I'd like to know who we're dealing with.
Do we have a second to the motion?
Okay, there you go.
Having heard none, the motion dies.
All right.
Okay, that was all of the material in the practical application framework. I don't know if there were, I mean, obviously we got into some specifics as we went. I don't know if there were any other specifics from what you reviewed that we could look at, or we could certainly bring back a red line version of the ordinance with the input that we were given, and give you.
That's what we're going to need to do with the additional 1,500-foot map.
Correct. Yeah, we could do that. So maybe that is the next step, is to bring it back with the 1,500 limitation illustrations, and we would go ahead and make the edits that were suggested at this meeting. And if it's the general consensus of the council, if you want us to go ahead and do that clean up at this point, where we go in and change the initial caps. And one of the things I noticed is as we were discussing terms and we would define them, we kind of kept stuff grouped together, but it's not in alphabetical order. But it made sense to discuss it while they were kind of all together. All the shelters were together instead of spreading them apart and having to look around. So we can begin to, I wouldn't say it would be in its final form when it comes back to you, because you still have at least the input on the 1,500 that needs to be provided. But obviously, if you have additional time to look at the draft in front of you, and now that you've really been through it at this point, you get a feel for how it works. If that raises any questions, or members of the public who are here this evening or maybe observed it, may have comments for you in the meantime. So I guess, Mayor, we would staff would be willing to work at the pleasure, of the council as far as a timeline to bring it back and when you might want to discuss it. And is that in a regular meeting? Is it in a special meeting or?
Well, I think that what we've got there is small enough to where we could do that in a regular meeting. I mean, what is the pleasure of council?
I agree. It may take us a few minutes in the regular council meeting.
Yeah.
Right, the 1,500-foot circle is gonna be the major discussion. So I'd say clean it up because, we don't wanna waste your time, but if we're gonna bring it back,
Have a special meeting.
Oh, no. Do you want a special meeting?
Well, do we need one, you think?
In my estimation, the changes are small enough to where I don't believe we need a special meeting. We can do that during a regular meeting.
I would agree.
I agree.
Okay. We'll bring it back to you to a regular meeting.
Yes, I would not be able to get it turned for Monday, and obviously, because we'd have a packet deadline in 2 days, just.
So the April 3rd meeting?
So, and I won't be present for that evening, because you have a special presentation that one of my other attorneys needs to provide. So I would suggest, we're probably looking at the 3rd of April.
Yep. That'll work.
Okay, we'll get it ready, and so that packet, I think, is due, Jason, on the 31st.
Whatever that Friday is.
Yeah, okay, so 31st. Okay. We'll make it happen.
Does anybody have any other changes or anything they'd like to throw in there before we adjourn?
I'd like to thank whomever accumulated all this information, and particularly the framework, which helped kind of put it in a box. Because there's a lot of information there, and it all kind of goes off in directions. But anyway, it was good to have that.
Thank you. It was a team effort by all staff.
Oh, thank you.
And some folks in my office as well that, to put that together. And hopefully you found like the index for the materials, that you could see what a story was, what an article was about, and you could go drill into it if you needed to. And so we spent a lot of time on the framework for sure.
I have one quick comment, on section 8, 443.
This is in the actual ordinance?
Yeah, it's talking about, temporary cooking for except day shelter, emergency housing, support services, temporary cooling shelters, temporary warming shelters, and transient dwelling houses.
Oh, yeah.
That's not in the definitions, and I'm not.
Yeah, okay, so, that is one, and you see my comments there. So, if you think way back, when we originally started this almost a year ago, when we were looking at the city's zoning code as to whether or not transitional services was a permitted use in the city, we identified that there was only one defined term that appeared to address transient services, and that was the definition of transient dwelling houses. So there is in existence a transient dwelling houses definition in the code today. Now, what we have to understand is that term was all by itself then, and the only purpose of it was to say that transient dwelling houses were prohibited in a C2 district, okay? That was before you did any sort of a comprehensive review of transient services, transitional services being provided. So certainly you could leave this definition and this use in. The only place it is currently in use and would remain in use in a C2 district would be to prohibit it in a C2 district. It's not otherwise permitted anywhere else, and there's no definition for it. The other option that you have is, if it's now unnecessary to address that, we could delete that definition and delete the reference to it in C2 and go with what you have in front of you. It could, I think, easily go either way. I don't think it would offend anything with the ordinance that you're working on to leave it in place, nor would you miss it if it were gone.
I just wanted clarification because I couldn't find a definition.
Yeah, that's the story on that one.
I'm okay. Anything further?
So with that, as it's written, we would leave the current transient dwelling house definition in place. It would only refer to it being prohibited in C2, and that would stay there. unless you want us to do anything else.
I'm good. Thank you.
Okay, I will entertain a motion to adjourn.
Second.
So moved. Second?
All right, meeting adjourned.